Hello, friends. In a moment, you'll hear a woman who was born in 1878 talk about her experiences as a child in the 1880s. Now, this is part 2, and if you've not listened to part 1 yet, I will leave a link in the description. In this segment, Mrs. Collins gives a very interesting description of her visit to the area now known as Beverly Hills. Back in those days, it was simply called the Hamel-Denker Ranch, and it was primarily used to grow lima beans. It was not until 1906 when a group of oil prospectors renamed the area Beverly Hills, after which began the construction of the famous Beverly Hills Hotel, as seen here in this photograph from 1912. Later on in the recording, Mrs. Collins speaks more about her childhood in Los Angeles, and lastly, she gives a very detailed account of her father, Cameron Thom, who was born in 1825 and became the mayor of Los Angeles in 1882. So without any more delay, let us get into this amazing first-hand account of history. The date of the recording is November 26th, 1964.
Well, anyhow, when I was a little girl, about 8 or 9 years old, the whole of practically the whole, at least 2/3 of Beverly Hills, was owned by two men. One was called Hamel and one was called Denker. And it was an enormous dairy farm, right down to where the little park is down here, now opposite the Beverly Hills Hotel. There was nothing but dirt roads, absolutely nothing, and my father was the lawyer for them. So the great treat was that sometimes when he had to come out and see them, he would come out in the buckboard, and I don't suppose any of you know what a buckboard is. It's a very uncomfortable little wagon with a high seat to 2 people on it, no rubber tires, and a horse. And you bumped along these awful roads. Well, I thought it was well lovely then, with great ruts, and we used to come out, and it would take us practically an hour or maybe an hour and a half to drive out here from 3rd Street, on really, really awful roads. And then we'd get here, and I don't know whether it was Hamel or Denker. My father would be cooped up with him in the office while they went through the returns and what the thing was doing and the various legal things he wanted my father to look into, and they turned me loose. And there were enormous pigsties, filthy dirty. Pigsties were in those days, It seemed to be the thing. The pigs were not happy unless they wallowed in filth and mud and dirt. And these were just in their prime, if that's what they wanted. And then he had enormous herds of cows. They used to make all their butter by hand, and they had huge dairies and great big flat tins. Well, can't tell you how big around they were. And these were on shelves, and they put the milk in those flat tins for the cream to rise. That's the way they worked in those days. Then they'd skim off the cream, and the butter was all churned by hand, so that naturally when we went home, we took some of this lovely, lovely fresh butter. But I always loved cream, and they turned me loose, and when nobody was looking, I'd find my way into the dairy where the cream was rising. And I'd stop at the top pan, and I'd work my way right down to the bottom pan, and as I went, I'd drag my finger across the cream and lick it, and lick it until I'd been to every pan on the whole plate. Nobody knew but me. And that was my day outing with my father, and it was gorgeous, and that I always wanted to go. When he'd say to me, "Would you like to go out to the farmer and the Denker and the so forth farm?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'd love it," because I'd lick all their cream. And now, of course, it's the smartest place in this part of the world to live, and I must say one of the most expensive. And they say if you live here, they don't have white lines down the street to show you which way the traffic should be moving, but the lines are made with white ermine, because the Beverly Hills people wouldn't understand it. It was just paint. And I live in the Beverly Hills Hotel, which I really love, but it's a very expensive way to live, but very comfortable. But when I sometimes look out and think how I knew it when it was a dairy farm and the pigsties with horses, and how I used to lick the cream, it rather makes me laugh to think what I did then and what I'm paying now. to look out the window. With a spoonful of cream, I could have bought the whole of the farm. In those days, for what they charge me now for a teaspoonful of cream. So there we are.
Now it's just about ready to warm up, you see.
Then turn it off then. Then what do I do?
Well, come on, show, right? Say something to it.
What can I say?
No, it's all right. Now it's going. Now you can start.
What do
with
I
your
say?
star.
Well, 3rd of July was my birthday. I was then 4 years old. And my second brother, Catesby, was a beautiful boy. He was. And very fair with big blue eyes. And we were all in the garden, and they had firecrackers, which came in little packages brought to us from Chinatown by our Chinese cook. And we had punks then to set them off, because I wasn't allowed to have them. Too precious. So Catesby had these firecrackers. Oh, I must tell you, he was such a beautiful boy, and he had a deep dimple in his chin, which he had until the day he died. And he was setting off these firecrackers, and I was a great admirer of his. And I said to him, and I suppose a broken little childish voice, "I like a dimple like yours." And he said, "Where?" And I put my little finger on my cheek, and I said, "Here." And believe it or not, I must have been very stoic. He took that red-hot punk and put it on my little tiny cheek and made a place, which turned into a great big blister. My mother was away ill, and when she came back, I had the most tremendous scar you've ever seen in your life. And I still have it, but it's quite small. It's grown over by fat and whatnots, I guess. Anyhow, that was that. And whenever Catesby used to be he was about over 8 years old then, because he was 4 years older than I was. And whenever he used to want to be rude to me, my mother would look at him and say, "How can you talk to her like that? Look how you disfigured her." That was that. So anyhow, I don't know whether I told you about Mr. Mesmer. In those days, we called the people that ran the shops Mr. Mesmer and Mr. Vanderlick and Mr. Whatnot. He had the shop, I told you, where we bought all of our shoes. And he amassed quite a lot of money. So when they started to build what is St. Vivianus Cathedral, the Roman Catholic Cathedral, which now stands in Main Street between 1st and 2nd, I think, and a wonderful old building, really, they came to him and asked him for a large donation. Remember, there were very few people here then, but most of them were Roman Catholics, and they gave generously. So he promised a very large donation. But when they came to collect the money, he had changed his mind, and he wasn't going to give it. He gave much smaller one. Well, the story that went around Los Angeles was, if you notice over the portico of the cathedral are 3 large black letters, D-O-M, which I believe are over most of the doors of most of the Roman Catholic cathedrals. It means something in Latin. I'm afraid I forgot what it means. And everybody, very few, most of the people knew, but they all laughed and said, "Do you know what happened? Mesmer refused to give the money, so when they finished the cathedral, they put D-O-M over the front doors, and that stands for Damn Old Mesmer."
I love that.
True, my father told me that story.
I think that's wonderful. Tell me some more.
I've come to the conclusion that my dear niece Rowena is nothing more or less than a slave driver. I thought I had finished with this business. I told her all about myself and my brothers when we were little, and now she wants to know all about my father. Well, my father was born in 1825 in Berry Hill, Culpeper County, on a magnificent estate owned by his father, Colonel John Thom, who at that time was Senator from Virginia, United States Senator from Virginia. He graduated from the University of Virginia. The university was founded exactly in the same year that my father was born. but he didn't go to school then, naturally. He had to wait a few years. So he and a friend of his called Skinner decided that they'd like to come to California and seek their fortunes and be away from everything and everybody and see a new life. So they joined one of these colored wagon things, I suppose very much like you see on the radio and the television and things. And they started out. Now, my father was very handsome. He was nearly 6'2", very slender, beautiful blue eyes, always gay, always charming, as the various lives that have been written about him have mentioned. Well, they came out, and after I don't know how long, they ran into a band of friendly Indians. They were with them for some days, and my father in his young days, like I suppose all Virginians were, was a very fine horseman. Otherwise, well, how could they have got any place if they weren't? And he had his own horse with him, which I imagine was a very fine horse. And the chief of the tribe invited him to run a race. Well, my father accepted, and he won the race. And as a prize, the chief wanted to present him with his daughter, which my father politely and courteously refused. Wouldn't it have been marvelous? I would have been an Indian. Imagine. I was as fair as a lily. Wouldn't I have been an Indian? So he refused, and the Indian lady, or daughter, or whatever you choose to call her, remained with her father. And I've often thought that maybe that old Indian did that on purpose and lost the race, because he wanted to get rid of the gal, naturally. They have millions of them. Well, they continued, and they landed in the northern part of the estate. They had horrible things happen to them, very awful hardships all the way. And then he landed in the northern part of the estate. We had many adventures and did many things and never found a bit of gold. And then he settled up in Marysville, and where he met the mother of what was to be my mother, who was my grandmother. And she was a most beautiful, beautiful lady. So was my mother. My mother was lovely to look at. She was fair, with the biggest blue eyes I've ever seen, and she had great intelligence, which after living for many years with my father and being taught by him, I expect, she became most intellectual. Well, anyhow, he lived up there for many years and did all sorts of things, and then he moved down to Los Angeles. And he had his office, he was quite young then, and he had his office up near the plaza. I think that's about the only part of Los Angeles where there were buildings where you could have an office. And he did what they called in those days, he hung out his shingle, and he was going to be a lawyer. And he used to walk home to lunch. In those days, there were no restaurants. You either walked home to lunch or you didn't have lunch. And he'd walk home for lunch, and he built the house that we were all born in, but at that time it was much smaller than it was afterwards, because as we came along, he had to add on a tremendously big wing, extra bedrooms, and all sorts of things. And he lived in what they call batched with an old friend of his, or a great friend of his. And they'd come home to lunch. They had a housekeeper who had 2 girls, and they did all the work and all the housework and all the cooking and everything. My father was always given, up to the day I imagine that he died, of playing practical jokes. He always did to me, but always. And as he came home this special day to lunch, he walked down what was then Main Street. No roads, I expect, just muddy ruts in the middle and sidewalks with wood across. And as he came past the plaza, as a rule, there were men there sitting on boxes who auctioned off land. Now, the land, as far as, I suppose, what would now be 9th Street, had houses on each side, sparse houses, sparsely in between. And after that, it was nothing but open fields, no roads, no anything, just real country. And there was a man that sat in the plaza and auctioned off this land. Anybody could buy it that wanted to buy it. And as my father came through, the man was auctioning it off, and as he came through, he threw over his shoulder, "Oh, I'll bid $1.50, and went on, thinking he was so funny. Came home, and when his friend that batched with him, William Broderick, came home, he said, "Cam, you bought an awful lot of land today." And he said, "Oh, I didn't buy any land. I never bought an acre." "Oh, but you did." He said, "You know, when you said $1.50, you had an awful lot of land knocked down to you for $1.50 an acre. Nothing but fields and open country and no roads, and what are you going to do?" Well, my father had to keep it, and he had it for many, many years until they started developing. But he always said he was land poor. He had all this land. Nobody bought it. Nobody built on it, and it was just that. Now, where the Standard Oil building stands, on the corner of Hope and Olympic, he owned from there right up to Figueroa Street. I really can't tell you how far it was or what distance it was, but the only thing that remains to remind us that that was once his property is an alley at the back of the Standard Oil building, and it's called Pembroke Alley. And my father named this little strip of land after Pembroke, who, by the way, was the apple of his eye. Well, that was that. And I can't think of anything else to tell you about what he did. I only know that everybody adored him.